Throughout the year, a database run by the International Maritime Organization and the International Labour Organization details vessels that have been abandoned. And at the start of each year, Transport Workers Union, the ITF, publishes a detailed look at the abandonment data for the year, which flags performed worse and which nationalities were most affected. In 2020, 85 vessels were reported as being abandoned. In 2023, that number was 142. A worrying increase, yes, but nothing compared to what was to come. Because in 2024, some 310 vessels were reported as abandoned. That is a 118% increase in just 12 months and gives 2024 the unwanted record as the worst year for seafarer abandonment, which incidentally it takes from 2023. Now, abandonment is not a new phenomenon by any stretch, but there has been an alarming spike in cases in the last couple of years. My name is Joshua Minchin, and I'm a reporter here at Lloyd List. In this episode, I'll be digging into those statistics a bit more to identify some patterns and find out what shipping's regulators are doing to drive down numbers that should shame everyone in our industry. Behind each one of those abandonment cases are, of course, individuals. And working from our shiny offices just off Blackfriars Bridge in London, I'm pretty far removed from the world many seafarers inhabit on a daily basis. So here's Steve Trousdale, the ITF's Global Inspectorate Coordinator, to paint a picture of what a case of abandonment really looks like for the seafarers that are left behind.
Dictionary terminology, it's something that's been left behind and you've walked away from it. The reality is that abandonment of seafarers anyway is not just about seafarers left on ships that have stopped working, the ships, but abandonment can also occur when the ships are still working, they're still traveling around the world, and the seafarers are working normally on board them. But a typical abandonment would be, an example would be one that we've recently resolved in one of the Gulf states. 5 seafarers who'd been on board for 14 months and were unpaid for 14 months. And they were receiving no provisions, no water, and no fuel for the ship. We came into it very much at the end of the 14 months, and they were relying on local welfare organisations to provide, the essentials of life. But we stepped in and we actually paid for provisions and fuel because people might think, why do you need provisions and water, but also fuel? Well, fuel is the thing that runs the engines, that runs the air conditioning, which runs the refrigeration. So these seafarers were actually sleeping on top of the ship on the deck because it was too hot inside because they had no air conditioning. So we get involved. We tried to tell seafarers to get in, contact us earlier than waiting 14 months, which is quite extreme. But many seafarers are, when they find themselves abandoned, which is under the Maritime Labour Convention, is 2 months or more owed wages, or a lack of repatriation at the end of their contract, or the company, the owner, has stopped communicating or providing the essentials. We often tell seafarers, don't wait for 14 months, for sure. As soon as it becomes 2 months, inform us. But many seafarers get trapped by owners' promises, if you like. Not this month, but definitely next month. And then you get into a cycle, where you're 6 months, 7 months, 8 months. Before you know it, you're at 14 months. And the seafarers then are in a position where they can't actually, as much as they want to get off the ship and go home and rebuild their lives, they're owed all this money. And if they walk off the ship, then they believe that, there's less chance or no chance of recovering their wages.
But why abandon a crew at all? Ships are, as I'm sure you know, worth a fair bit of money, and we operate in a period where there's a huge shortage of able seafarers. So why create a name for yourself as an owner that leaves crews high and dry? Here's Steve again.
When ship owners get into trouble financially, there are a few areas that they can cut immediately without affecting the running of the ship. So, but if the ship's obviously still working and still travelling, you can, and this is what abandonment is, you can cut the wages, you can not pay the seafarers. Many seafarers will continue to work on board the ship if they're not paid. Others sometimes do try to make a stand, but it's not particularly easy. So you can cut the wages. You can cut the food and the water provisions, and don't send them as regularly or don't send them at all in some cases. And in extreme cases, you cut the fuel. If the ship's not doing anything, not operating anything, then you can cut the fuel as well to save that money. But if it is a working ship is traveling, if you cut the wages and the provisions and cut down on this kind of thing, you can make a lot of savings. Okay, 23, 24 people on a ship each month with a salary bill is quite a sum of money. If you cut that by 1, 2, 3 months, then your ship's still operating. And what are you losing? You've still got to pay. You can't not pay for fuel for the ship to work and to travel, for port dues, all the other dues that the ship has to pay in order to operate. So the first thing the ship owners always go for are the wages, followed by the provisions, the food, the water, and the fuel. Sometimes if it's actually a ship, and if it's a ship in port, whilst they not paying the wage, if it's stuck in port like the one I said to you, the 14 months, they don't want to get rid of the vessel because, as you said, it's an asset. And eventually that ship may start working again. It may not have been working for some time, but it may start working at some time. The last thing they want to do is get rid of the vessel because then they lose that opportunity to earn the money.
Director of Legal Affairs and External Relations at the IMO, Dr. Dorota Lost-Sieminska, pointed out that actually what we could be seeing is just better reporting.
This is what I would like to emphasize, is that we see a spike in the reported cases. We really don't know whether there is a spike in real numbers, because we may have a situation in which in the past there were also a big number of cases, but they were simply not reported. So it's very difficult to say whether the awareness and the work that was done by IMO and ILO in highlighting the problem, whether that was the cause of the cases being registered and reported. It's also that we cooperate very closely with ITF, with ICS and other organizations to bring awareness, to talk to flag states, to talk to member governments. The knowledge and if I may say so, the promotion of the subject and the problem highlighted that there is a need for better cooperation, and this might be the cause why the cases are widely reported right now to the database.
Steve agreed and explained that seafarers themselves are perhaps more aware now of what constitutes abandonment and are more confident to report cases to the ITF.
I think in recent years, the last 2 or 3 years, the reporting of abandonments has been better because I think so many seafarers are now aware of what constitutes abandonment according to the Maritime Labour Convention. So they know that after 2 months, they can stick their hand in the air and say, we think we've been abandoned. And many of the cases that we had last year were for seafarers that were owed 2 or 3 months. Historically, it's been a lot of seafarers that have been owed 9, 10, 12, months more than that. But I think that with social media, I think with greater use of WhatsApp and that, seafarers are talking to their friends and colleagues on other ships. We've been very proactive across social media in sharing stories about abandonment, not just on our own instance on Facebook, for instance, but we've been sharing it through many, many seafarers groups together. So I think seafarers are much more informed than they've ever been. And now really have a real understanding of what constitutes abandonment and know that they can put their hand up and say, we need some assistance.
To understand how shipping can better get a handle on abandonment, we first need to understand what happens when a case is reported to the IMO. Here's Dorota again to take us through the process the regulator goes through when it's notified of an abandonment incident.
Whenever we are aware of an abandonment case, we receive notification. Usually, the notification we would receive from ITF, and we contact the flag state and the port state, and the case is inserted into the database. Flag states and port states have a certain period of time to respond to us and to resolve the case. In those situations when the case is not resolved, we of course put it reflected onto the database that the case has not been resolved, and we follow up with flag state and with port state to ensure that seafarers have assistance and that they are repatriated to their homes, basically. So we have a dedicated person, a senior legal officer working in my division, in the legal division of the IMO, who is constantly working on those cases, and he's also dealing directly with the flag states and the port states, and is also does follow up whether the case is resolved or not. So the cooperation between on the one hand, IMO, ILO, and our partners from ITF and ICS is crucial, and on the other hand, also the contacts that we get with the flag states and the port states and follow up is also crucial in resolving the cases. And we do have some successes. We do have some cases resolved, seafarers repatriated, and the wages paid. We are working on it very hard to ensure that we get as many cases resolved as possible.
Flag states, then, are crucial in this. Without exposing you to several clauses of the Maritime Labour Convention, it is quite clear that signatories to that convention have a responsibility to ensure seafarers on vessels that fly its flag are afforded their rights under the MLC, and in cases of abandonment, must cover the cost of repatriation when an owner fails to make arrangements. But not all flag states perform as well as they perhaps could do, and the same is true in the context of abandonment. ITF data shows the flags with the most abandonments in 2024 were Panama, Palau, Tanzania, Comoros, Cameroon, Bahrain, Togo, St. Kitts and Nevis, and Vanuatu. Panama's unwanted position at the top of that list is perhaps explained by the sheer amount of tonnage that sails under its flag. It's always going to have a lot of abandonment cases. But that's not necessarily true for all of those flags mentioned. Here's Steve again.
But if you look at the second flag below Panama is Palau, a tiny little island in the Pacific with a register of just over 300, I think. If you applied the percentage of Palau vessels that were abandoned, if you applied that percentage to Panama, instead of Panama having 37 or whatever it was for last year, they would have had 700. So 10% of a small island register like Palau, that's an outrageous position to be in for such a small island and a small register. But you see many of the other registers, Tanzania and Cameroon, St. Kitts, they're all fairly small registers, but they've got significant amounts of abandonment.
I should mention at this juncture that Lloyd's List did approach the registry of Palau for comment, but did not receive a reply. If flag states don't police their vessels or intervene in cases of abandonment, well then who polices the flag states? Here's the Rutter again to explain what the IMO is doing to ensure flag states do what is required of them.
We are working with the flag states to ensure that they really implement their obligations and they perform their flag state jurisdiction to ensure that their fleet complies with global standards, including those that are related to seafarers. Unfortunately, some flag states lack resources and lack mechanisms to perform their oversight obligations. And on a daily basis, it's not only during the big meetings like the meetings of the legal committee or the maritime safety committee, but also behind the scenes. We are working with flag states and also with states providing the seafarers to ensure that all flag states perform well, and that they really implement their obligations and their responsibilities.
That question still remains. What happens if flags just don't do what they're supposed to do?
Those flag states that do not perform in cases of abandonment are listed in the database and reported to the IMO member states. So this is kind of one downside, that they are listed as not performing. The other is, of course, the IMO member states audit scheme. Every member state, every IMO member state is audited in every 7 years, in the 7-year cycle. So the non-compliance is identified and is also reflected in the member state audit scheme reports.
Naming and shaming then seems to be the modus operandi of the IMO. But is that enough to force those worst performing flags into action? Here's Steve Trousdale once again.
No. I mean, we've been naming and shaming for a number of years now. We've got records going back to 2011 when showing that we were submitting abandonments, which is obviously before MLC and everything, but 132 in 2023, 312 2024. Naming shaming is not working, because we do name and shame regularly. We name and shame companies that are serial abandonment specialists, if you like, and everybody, wrings their hands and says this is a bad state of affairs. But what's changing? The number should be going down, not up. And if 2025 is anything to go on, we've already submitted a lot of abandonments for 2025 already. And if it continues in the number that we've already done, we will outstrip 2024. The decisions have got to come, as far as we're concerned, from the international bodies, the IMO, the ILO, but certainly governments have got a place in this as well. Action against some companies, for instance. There are some Gulf states with 1 or 2 companies who have abandoned constantly on their ships, but are allowed to do it even though we're naming and shaming them. There are some companies that continually abandon across their fleet with no action from the government at all in that particular country. I think governments have got to step up a lot more on this. They've got to be a lot more vigilant on their registers. They've got to be looking at the ship owners that they are allowing to register under their flags. And the ITF, yes, we'll continue to report these kind of things, because obviously, to be honest with you, if we don't, and we did all 312 last year, if we don't, who else is going to report it, and who else is going to? But governments, the ILO, the IMO, have got to get together and work out, how are we going to tackle this problem? We can't keep going year after year and just saying, that's bad, abandonment's gone up and it's bad, and then, the rest of the year we just, leave it alone and nobody think. The only real focus it gets, apart from when you do naming and shaming through the year and you get particularly bad abandonments, like we had the guy who was on for 12 years a couple of years ago, the only real focus he's got is when we release the stats at the beginning of the year. And then it peters away for the rest of the year until we get to January 2026, and we'll find ourselves doing this again.
If naming and shaming is not an effective weapon, then what should the IMO do? And let's not forget that the IMO is a UN body comprised of 176 member states. It doesn't have enforcement power. It is not a police force. For that reason, the arsenal it has to select from is fairly empty. In a way, naming and shaming is one of the only options available to it. Instead, Steve thinks that other authorities should take a much greater role in driving down abandonment cases.
The ILO and the governments and organisations like the ITF brought the Maritime Labour Convention together, and countries are very quick to ratify it when it first came out. A lot of FOCs ran and ratified it quickly, almost for me as a flag bearing exercise. We ratified MLC, we're a good register. The reality is that, as I say, some of them are just not standing up to their responsibilities, and I don't think I have the answer on how we force flags to stand up to their responsibilities. There are certain countries around the world that are taking abandonment seriously, and they're not allowing ships into their ports where there is an open abandonment case on. They're making the owners fix the problem before they can come into the port. Very proactive approach, and it's working, because we've seen 3 or 4 vessels with open abandonments that have had to be resolved before the ship could go in or load and unload in their particular port. So maybe that's an odds, and maybe some of the flags that are not standing up responsibilities, maybe their ships are prevented from going into certain countries. Not everybody, it's like the Maritime Labour Convention, not everybody will sign up for it, but if you had more countries and you started squeezing these ships could go, maybe that would be one way of reducing it. I think it's got to be that governments take a greater responsibility for the ships coming into their ports. It's easy, it is easy to monitor ships that are coming into your port. It's easy to see whether there are issues on board the ships. I know it's time consuming, if I just take an example, a country like India, for them to monitor every ship going into the different ports around India is time consuming. That, but if governments were to take a much greater stand on this kind of practice, then maybe we can see the numbers dropping down from 312 throughout the years until it becomes what it should be, a very rare occurrence that we see abandonment. Because this is a betrayal of those workers. This abandonment is a betrayal, and we should all be standing up to this. But the problem is with seafarers is they're a hidden workforce. So people abuse and get away with abuse. I use this quite a lot, but if you walk down the street and say to somebody on the street, when was the last time you saw a bus driver? They can say, well, I saw a bus go past me. I saw the man or the woman driving the bus. What about a train driver? Yeah, well, I stood on the platform and the train came out. When was the last time you saw a seafarer? Never seen one. And that's the problem. They're unseen, and therefore they're forgotten. And governments, the ILO, the IMO, and everybody else that can make a decision on their working lives needs to stand up and say, this is not acceptable.
Steve's right. Abandonment is a betrayal of a workforce that is largely unseen by society, and yet, as I'm sure everyone listening to this podcast is aware, contribute an enormous amount to it. The fact that there's a good chance we'll outstrip 2024 this year based on the rate of cases already reported is nothing less than frightening. And there's a good chance I'll be speaking to you at exactly the same time in 2025 about the exact same topic. That's what we've got time for this week. Thank you so much to Steve and Dorota for their insights, and thank you, of course, to you for listening. We'll be back next week with more stories shaping shipping, but if you can't wait until then, remember, you can listen to every single episode of the Lloyd's List podcast on SoundCloud, Spotify, and the Lloyd's List app. That's it this week, though. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.